There's a particular kind of silence that lives inside old houses. Not the silence of emptiness. Not the silence of abandonment. This is a different animal entirely. Thick and pressurized like the air before a storm that never quite breaks. My grandfather's house had that silence. Had it for years, far as I can remember. As a child, I thought it came from the walls, from the dark wood paneling that swallowed light the way a church swallows sound. As a teenager, I decided it came from him, from my grandfather, Reginald Ashworth Colborne, who hadn't laughed at anything since 1987 and who spoke in full, measured sentences the way people do when they've spent decades deciding which words deserve to be said aloud. Now I think it came from the sword. I'm getting ahead of myself. That's the problem with telling this story. It wants to begin in the middle with my hands shaking and the blade resting across my palms and the sound of my grandfather's old clock marking time in the hallway. But every story needs a before. So here's the before. My name is Daniel. Daniel Colborne. I'm 34. I'm a secondary school history teacher in Leeds. And until 3 years ago, the most remarkable thing I owned was a first edition copy of The Right Stuff that I'd found in a charity shop for £2.50 and which I was frankly too smug about. I lived in a flat above a dry cleaner's. I ate cereal for dinner more often than I should probably admit. I was, by every metric that mattered, ordinary. Then my grandfather died, and he left me the sword. Not just the sword, technically. The house, too, and the contents of a modest savings account, and a standing order to a regimental charity that I kept going because it felt wrong to stop. But the sword was the thing that came with instructions. A letter, written in his precise, slightly formal hand, sealed with actual wax. I didn't know anyone still used sealing wax. My grandfather, apparently, had used it for years. The letter said, "Daniel, you are reading this because I am no longer able to carry it myself." The sword served in the regiment from 1941 through to its decommissioning. It was carried by your great-great-uncle Bernard at El Alamein. It was carried by your great-uncle Thomas at the regiment's final ceremonial parade in 1994. I carried it at every regimental dinner for 41 years. It will now be yours to carry. You will understand what I mean by this in time. Take care of the blade. Keep the edge sharp. The scabbard needs oil every 6 months. Proper leather oil, not that synthetic rubbish. This matters. Carry it well. RAC. That was the whole letter. No explanation of what carry it meant, practically speaking. No note about the weight of the thing, which I discovered when I first lifted it from the case and nearly dropped it on my own foot. No acknowledgement that I was a secondary school history teacher in Leeds with no military connection whatsoever, no regiment to belong to, no regimental dinners to attend. Just carry it well. I stood in the study holding that sword, and I remember this distinctly, well, old man, you have absolutely done it to me. The sword is a pattern 1796 heavy cavalry saber. That's the official designation, the thing you'd find in an auction catalog. Curved blade, 33 inches. Brass stirrup hilt, which sounds decorative but is in fact functional, designed to protect the hand during the kind of close-quarters fighting that nobody has done on horseback for 150 years. The blade is steel, kept to a mirror polish that I have spent 3 years maintaining with a degree of obsessive attention that would have alarmed my previous self considerably. It weighs, according to the postal scale I used to satisfy my own curiosity in those first weeks, 2 pounds and 14 ounces. That is a fact. It is also, in my experience, completely wrong. I took it home on the train, which, in retrospect, was an experience I should have thought through more carefully. I had it in the original leather case, a long, narrow box that gave absolutely no indication of its contents, which I told myself was fine, which I convinced myself was fine, right up until a woman with a small terrier sat opposite me at Doncaster, and the terrier immediately lost its mind. Just lost it completely. Barking, straining at the lead, ears flat, the whole performance. The woman kept apologizing. I kept smiling. The terrier kept telling me, in terms that needed no translation, that it wanted me and whatever I was carrying to depart the carriage immediately. I moved to the vestibule. Standing there, between carriages, the case propped against the door, I became aware for the first time of how the thing fell to my hands. Heavy. not alarmingly so. I'd lifted heavier boxes of books, but present. The way a full rucksack is present. You feel it in the shoulders before you feel it in the arms. 2 pounds 14 ounces, I told myself. My shoulders disagreed. I put it down against my legs and looked at the passing Midlands through the scratched window glass. Somewhere out there, my grandfather was 3 days buried, and his house was sitting empty, and his particular brand of oppressive silence was already beginning, I suspected, to dissipate without him to generate it. I picked the case back up. Heavier. Still heavier than before. I thought, the bag has slipped. My grip has shifted. I adjusted. Still heavier. I thought, I'm tired. It's been a long week. That was probably true. Grief is weight. I'd heard people say. Maybe I was feeling the grief in my arms. I got off the train at Leeds and walked home through November rain and put the case on my kitchen table and did not open it for 6 days. The first time I took it to a regimental event was a mistake I made with the best possible intentions. One of the charity contacts had emailed. A Major Jeffrey Aldous, retired, who had apparently been corresponding with my grandfather for 20 years about regimental history, and who had taken it upon himself to welcome me into what he called, without apparent irony, the family. There was a dinner, annual, black tie, at a hotel in Peterborough that looked like the inside of a hunting lodge and served the kind of food that takes genuinely heroic effort to make dull. I wore my one good suit, which is navy, and which I bought for a job interview in 2019, and which still fits just about if I don't breathe too deeply. I brought the sword. This was correct, as it turned out. There is a tradition. Jeffrey explained it over pre-dinner drinks, a glass of something that tasted like wood smoke, and apology of the sword being present at regimental dinners. Not displayed, not locked in a cabinet, carried in, carried out, by whoever holds the stewardship. Stewardship, that was his word. Not ownership, not possession. You are steward of it, he said, and looked at the case the way you look at a person you haven't seen in years. As your grandfather was. As Bernard was. I asked if Bernard had been someone Jeffrey knew. Jeffrey's expression did something complicated that I didn't quite have the vocabulary to read. Bernard Colborne, he said, asterisk was before my time. But I have read his account of El Alamein. Every man in the regiment has. It is asterisk. He stopped, cleared his throat, adjusted his cufflinks, which were shaped like small shields. It is a remarkable account. I hadn't known there was an account. My grandfather hadn't mentioned one. I made a note to find it. Later, at dinner, I carried the sword in, as instructed. Jeffrey walked me through it beforehand, quietly in the corridor, with the patient thoroughness of a man who understands that ceremony must be taught, and is never embarrassed to teach it. You hold the case in both hands. You carry it level. You set it on the table to the right of your place setting. It remains there for the duration of the dinner. When the room rises for the loyal toast, you hold it again. When the room sits, you set it down again. Simple. Dignified. Fine. Except that by the time I lifted it for the loyal toast, 2 hours after I'd carried it in, 2 hours of red wine, and memories I didn't share, and conversations I half followed about people I didn't know, the case felt like it had been filled with sand. My arms shook, genuinely shook. I steadied them by will. I held the thing level. I did not drop it. I did not embarrass myself or my grandfather's memory or Bernard at El Alamein or the regiment. But Jeffrey, standing beside me, noticed. He said nothing then. Later, walking to our cars through a car park that smelled of cold exhaust and old leaves, he said, "You felt it too, then?" I said, "Felt what?" He looked at the case under my arm. The weight of it. I said, "It's heavier than it should be." Jeffrey nodded slowly. And this is the part that has stayed with me, that I come back to when I'm trying to make sense of the thing. He said, "It gets heavier every year. I noticed it with your grandfather. He was a strong man, Reginald. Carried it level until he was 79. But in the last few years you could see it. Costing him something." I asked, "What's in it? Has anyone opened the case and weighed the swords separately?" Jeffrey looked at me with something that was not quite pity and not quite amusement. "Of course," he said. 2 pounds and 14 ounces. Checked it myself in 1987 when Reginald first mentioned the heaviness. Had a regimental armorer go over it. balance, steel content, hilt weight, everything. Nothing unusual. Nothing added. Nothing changed. A car went past. Its headlights lit the fog briefly. And yet, Jeffrey said. And yet, I said. We stood there for a moment in the parking lot, the two of us, not saying anything else. Because there wasn't anything else to say that wouldn't sound foolish or superstitious or both. And we were both, I think, the kinds of men who are frightened of sounding foolish. Then he shook my hand, got in his car, and drove away. And I stood there holding the case, and I noticed very carefully, very deliberately, that my arms were aching. 2 pounds, 14 ounces. I walked my car. The case felt like a small engine block. I found Bernard's account 3 weeks later. It was in a box in the regimental archive. Jeffrey arranged access, quietly, without making a production of it. The archive was housed in a room at the back of a Territorial Army Center outside Leicester. Beige walls, fluorescent lights, the smell of archive boxes, which is a very specific smell, old paper and faint mildew, and something almost like dust but drier. The account was handwritten, 47 pages, dated September 1943. Bernard Colborne had written it from a hospital in Cairo while recovering from the wound that had ended his service. His handwriting was nothing like my grandfather's, looser, faster, letters crashing into each other with what felt like urgency. Most of it I won't recount here. Most of it was tactical, geographical, the kind of precise detail that made me understand why Jeffrey had called it remarkable. Bernard had an eye. He noticed things. The temperature at dawn versus the temperature at noon. The sound of tank tracks on different surfaces. The way smoke moved. But there was a passage, near the end, page 43, that stopped me. It was about the sword. He had carried it at a formal inspection 3 days before the battle. A ceremonial thing, as much as anything could be ceremonial in the desert in wartime. He'd been given it to carry, he wrote, because the senior officer whose job it normally was had gone down with dysentery, and Bernard was the next in line. He'd received it that morning from the adjutant. He'd expected it to feel like a sword. He'd handled swords before, at academy. Nothing remarkable. Instead, he wrote, it felt like carrying a man. I don't mean this as poetry. I mean the weight of it was personal, directed, as if the thing was leaning into me specifically. I asked Corporal Whitmore to hold it for a moment while I adjusted my belt. He held it, passed it back, and said, I remember this exactly. Light thing, isn't it? The thing did not feel light. It felt like obligation made metal. I read that paragraph 4 times. Obligation made metal. I sat in that beige room under fluorescent lights, and I held Bernard's words in my mind, and I thought about my grandfather at 79, arms shaking under the weight of a 2-pound sword. I thought about the terrier on the train. I thought about Jeffrey's face in the parking lot. It gets heavier every year. I closed the archive box. I drove home. I took the sword out of the case for the first time since bringing it home, and I sat at my kitchen table, and I held it across my palms, the blade flat, the edge pointed away from me the way my grandfather's letter had implicitly demanded with its insistence on the importance of kept edge. I sat with it for a long time. The clock on my wall marked the half hour, marked the hour. The sword was heavy in ways I did not know how to measure. I thought, Bernard called it obligation made metal. But that's not quite right, is it? I thought, it's not obligation. Obligation is something you choose or fail to choose. This is something else. Outside, someone was playing music 2 floors down, something with bass, indistinct through the ceiling. The dry cleaner's extraction fan hummed its usual low note. Leeds did its late evening thing. I thought, it's memory, not yours, not anyone's you've met. But it's in here. It accumulated. And every year you carry it, it takes more of you, because every year there's more of it. I set the sword back in its case. I oiled the scabbard. Proper leather oil, not the synthetic rubbish. This matters. The second year, I started noticing other people's arms. It became a habit, the way bad habits do, quietly, sideways, before you have the language to name it as a habit at all. I'd watch people on the street carrying things, and I'd think, is that heavy for you? Does it feel like what it weighs, or like something else? A woman carrying a baby on her hip. A man with a toolbox. A kid dragging a school bag by one strap. bent sideways under the weight of it. I'd watch and I'd think, what is the actual weight? And what is the accumulated weight? And do you know the difference? I don't tell people this. It sounds unwell, but the sword had done something to my thinking, changed the calibration of something. I couldn't measure it precisely, only observe that it had happened. The way you observe a shift in your own handwriting and understand some time has passed, but couldn't tell you exactly when the shift occurred. The second regimental dinner, I managed better. I knew what was coming. I've been lifting the case at home, regularly, the way you train for something. Not because I thought you could train for this particular thing, but because I didn't know what else to do, and doing something is always marginally better than doing nothing. I'd lift it, hold it level, note the weight, set it down, repeat. The weight at home was fine. Normal. 2 pounds 14 ounces of perfectly average metal object. At the dinner, standing in that hunting lodge hotel again, surrounded by men in black tie who had collectively served more years in uniform than I had been alive. The case went heavy the moment I stepped out of the car. I felt it happen, like a load shifted, like walking into altitude. My shoulders understood it before my arms did. I carried it level. I set it on the table to the right of my place setting. I held it for the loyal toast. Jeffrey watched me the whole evening with an expression I was beginning to understand. It was not concern exactly. It was the expression of a man who has already done something hard and is now watching someone else begin to understand it will be hard. After, in the car park again, this had become our ritual, the car park debrief. He asked, "Heavier?" I said yes. He nodded. I asked, "Does it ever stop?" He thought about it for a long moment. A genuine consideration, not a dismissal. I appreciated that. "I don't believe so," he said. "I believe it accumulates. I believe that is in some sense the point. There is a particular quality to the evenings before a ceremonial event that I've come to recognize over the past 3 years. The night before the second dinner, I'd slept badly. The night before the third, I hadn't slept at all, just lay in the dark listening to leads and thinking about Bernard in a Cairo hospital, writing 47 pages in handwriting that leaned with urgency. But the quality, isn't insomnia. It's something more specific than that. It's the quality of attention. On those evenings I become, without deciding to, more attentive. I notice things I normally move through. The light in my flat at 7 o'clock, which is a particular pale gold in summer and a particular purple-gray in winter. The sound the case makes when I set it on the kitchen table, a resonance that I have decided is probably just hollow wood, but which sounds, if I'm in the wrong frame of mind, like something settling. The smell of the leather oil. The way the blade, when I clean it, shows me a distorted, fisheye version of my own face. I look older in the blade. I know this is refraction. I know it is the curve of polished metal playing tricks. I know this. I still check every time. The event that changed my understanding of the sword happened not at a regimental dinner, but on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in March. I was doing lesson prep, Year 10 history, the First World War, and I'd brought the case into school because I had a meeting immediately after school and didn't want to leave it in my flat all day. I know that sounds strange. I couldn't tell you, in rational terms, why it felt wrong to leave it alone, but it did. It had begun to feel wrong to leave it alone. The case was on the floor beside my desk, tucked against the wall. One of my students, a girl named Priya, Year 10, frequently either the smartest person in the room or completely elsewhere, rarely anything in between, came in early before the others, wanted to talk about her essay. She sat across from my desk, and we talked through her argument, which was actually quite good, and then she stopped mid-sentence looking at the floor. "What's in that?" she said. I told her. A ceremonial sword. Regimental. Very old. Her expression did something. "Can I see it?" I should have said no. There was a reason I should have said no that had to do with safeguarding protocols and common sense and the fact that she was 15. But the truth is that nobody had ever asked to see it before. Jeffrey had seen it, of course, and the armorer who'd waited in 1987. But nobody had ever asked. I lifted the case onto the desk, opened it, laid it flat. Priya looked at the sword for a long time without touching it. She was a careful person, which I'd noticed before. Careful with words, careful with her ideas, the kind of student who edits herself before she speaks. "Can I hold it?" she said. No, I said, which was correct. She nodded, still looking. It looks heavy, she said. I almost said, it weighs 2 pounds 14 ounces. But I stopped. Why does it look heavy to you? I asked instead. She thought about it. Priya always thought about it. I don't know, she said. Asterisk, it looks like it's got things inside it that I can't see. Like, asterisk, she paused, re-editing. Like when you look at a very old building and you know it's held more weather than you're ever going to. You can just tell. I looked at her. She looked at the sword. Held more weather than you're ever going to, I said. That's going in my lesson notes. She grinned and left. I sat with the sword on my desk until the other students arrived, and I had to close the case and shift into teacher mode, which is a different mode entirely. Louder, more performative, less interior. But Priya's words sat with me through the rest of the day, sat with me on the drive home, sat with me that evening while I ate cereal over the kitchen sink, and watched the dry cleaner's extraction fan turn in the wet March air. Things inside it that I can't see. Held more weather. I want to tell you about the month I tried to put it down. Not literally. Not abandon it. I want to be clear about that. I never considered abandoning it. Not in any real way. The thought crossed my mind twice, and both times felt like what I imagined it would feel like to consider abandoning a person. Wrong in a way that went deeper than practical objection. But I did try to stop thinking about it. Stop attending to it. I went 2 months without taking it out of the case, without oiling the scabbard, without anything. I missed the annual cleaning I'd put in my calendar. I told myself this was fine. Normal, even lots of people have inherited objects they put in storage and don't think about. I was a secondary school history teacher in Leeds, not a custodian of some. I didn't finish that sentence even inside my own head. At the end of those 2 months, I had the worst 6 weeks of insomnia I've had since I was 22 and waiting for exam results. I want to be very clear, saying these things were causally related. I'm not a superstitious person. I am a history teacher who understands deeply, professionally, how human beings attribute cause to coincidence, how we build narrative from sequence. I know how that works. I took the sword out of the case. I cleaned the blade. I oiled the scabbard. I slept that night. The 3rd regimental dinner was in a different hotel. The Peterborough one had closed or changed hands or something. This one was in Nottingham. Same aesthetic, dark wood, mounted antlers, food that had been through a lot. I drove down early and spent the afternoon walking around the city center. There's a castle in Nottingham. I'd taught it, the parliamentary siege, the Civil War, and I walked up to it and stood outside and thought about the particular English habit of converting sites of violent historical significance into pleasant tourist attractions with cafe facilities. I wasn't being cynical about it. I found it genuinely comforting. The castle had held more weather. It was still there. People were eating sandwiches outside it. I brought the case, of course. It was in the boot of my car in the hotel car park. And as I stood outside the castle thinking about sieges and sandwiches, I became aware, at a distance of roughly half a mile, that the case felt heavier. That sounds insane. I know it sounds insane. I couldn't feel the weight of the case from half a mile away. But I could feel the fact of it, the pull of it, the awareness that it was somewhere specific in the world, and I was somewhere else, and there was a direction between us. I walked back to the hotel. I took the case out of the boot and carried it inside, and I held it, and it was heavy, heavy in that specific way it gets at these events, and I stood in the hotel corridor outside the dining room, and I thought, 3rd year. It's heavier than last year, heavier than the year before. Jeffrey found me in the corridor. He'd aged a little since I'd seen him. 8 months between dinners. 8 months being an efficient unit of time when you're in your late 70s. He walked with a cane now that he hadn't had at the first dinner. He looked at my arms. Heavier, he said. Yes, I said. He nodded, as if I'd confirmed something he'd been waiting to confirm. I've been thinking about what it means, he said. He lowered himself into a chair that sat against the corridor wall. Asterisk, I've been thinking about it for 40 years, to be honest. Ever since your grandfather first mentioned it. 40 years, and I still don't have. Asterisk, he stopped, looked at the carpet. Old hotel carpet, burgundy, and fleur-de-lis. I still don't have the language for it that satisfies me. I sat in the chair beside him, case across my knees. Tell me the language you have so far, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, someone was laughing in the dining room, a big room-filling laugh that came through the door and dissipated. I think, he said slowly, asterisk that objects carried with intention accumulate something. Not memory. Memory is too passive. Something more active. Some residue of attention. Bernard carried it to war. Thomas carried it to the regiment's last day. Reginald carried it for 41 years of dinners and toasts and the long afterward when the regiment existed only in the memory of the men who'd served. And each of them, asterisk he paused, each of them put something in it, deliberately or not. It accepted it. The metal accepted it, the way old metal does. I thought about Priya, things inside it you can't see. And every steward, Geoffrey continued, carries not just the sword but everything that's been put in. Everything. Bernard's desert. Thomas's pride at the last parade. Reginald's grief for the regiment and the men gone before. And now my weight's being added, I said. Yes, Geoffrey said simply. I looked at the case on my knees. That's why it gets heavier. That is why it gets heavier. We sat there in the corridor for another minute, the laughing from the dining room fading and reforming, the carpet very burgundy and very fleur-de-lis. Then Geoffrey put his hands on his cane and stood slowly with the deliberateness of a man who has decided not to let anything beat him to upright. Shall we go in? He said. I stood, adjusted my grip on the case. Yes, I said. Heavy as a man, heavy as memory, heavy as 41 years of grief for the regiment and the men gone before. I carried it in, not for the sword. I told myself when I booked the flight. For the history, professional interest, I was developing a 6-4 module in the North African campaign and primary experience of the landscape, the scale of the desert, the particular light of the place, would be genuinely useful. Professionally useful. That was the reason. I brought the case. If that surprises you, imagine how it surprised me, standing in my flat at 6 in the morning with my passport and my boarding card and the case beside my suitcase, looking at it and thinking, what exactly do you think you're doing? The answer that came back was not articulate. It was not logical. It was something closer to what Priya had described, the sense of direction between two things that belong in proximity. I checked it in. The airline took it without difficulty. I had the documentation Geoffrey had helped me prepare in case. The case came through customs in Cairo, untroubled. I'm not going to romanticize Egypt for you. I know how that goes. Western traveler arrives in ancient land, finds themselves moved, writes something that is more about themselves than the place. I'm aware of that trap. I'll try to avoid it. What I'll tell you is practical, factual. The memorial is at a place called El Alamein on the coast road, west of Alexandria. The Commonwealth War Graves site is orderly, maintained with a precision that would not surprise anyone who knows the Commission's standards, which are very high and sustained across decades at enormous expense of care. The headstones are pale stone. The grass between them is kept. There's a register in a small building near the entrance where you can look up names. I looked up Bernard Colborne. He isn't there. He survived El Alamein, survived the hospital in Cairo, was invalided out, and came home and lived until 1971 in a village in Somerset, keeping bees and voting labor and apparently never discussing the war with anyone, which was a common practice and which I understood, reading his account in a way I couldn't have understood it before. But some of the men who had served with him were there. I found 3 names I recognized from his account. 3 men he'd mentioned by name, with a particular specificity that meant they'd mattered to him specifically, not just as faces in a unit. A Corporal Whitmore, the same Corporal Whitmore who'd held the sword and called it light. A Sergeant Davies, a private whose first name Bernard had noted with careful informality. Jimmy Holt of Burnley, who could sleep anywhere and who once traded his ration biscuits for a dog-eared copy of Dickens and read it 4 times through before Medellin. Jimmy Holt of Burnley. The headstone said, J.R. Holt, private, died November 4th, 1942, age 21. I stood in front of it for a while. I'd brought the case. I did not take the sword out. I held the case, in both hands, level, the way you carry it at ceremony. And it was the heaviest it has ever been. Heavier than the first dinner. Heavier than the Nottingham Hotel corridor. heavier than anything I'd held before that wasn't a geological object. My arms shook. I let them shake. I did not try to still them. I stood in front of Jimmy Holt's headstone with my arms shaking under the weight of a 2-pound sword, and I let whatever was happening in my chest happen, and I did not try to name it. The November desert light was clean and white and absolutely merciless. I've thought about this a lot since coming home. Thought about it with the particular attention I give to things I don't understand but can't dismiss. The same attention I give to historical events that don't fit the received narrative, which is actually the part of my job I'm best at. Here's what I think. Provisionally, with all appropriate epistemic humility, I think the sword is not haunted. I want to be clear about that. Haunted is the wrong word entirely. It implies something passive, something left behind by accident, a residue no one intended. What the sword holds is not an accident. It is the opposite of an accident. Bernard carried it at formal inspection 3 days before the worst battle of his life. He was 23 years old. He was about to go into the desert and watch people die, including, as it turned out, Corporal Whitmore and Sergeant Davies and Jimmy Holt of Burnley, who read Dickens 4 times through. He carried the sword with intention because ceremony requires intention, because the ritual of carrying a blade at formal inspection is not a performance of valor, but a rehearsal of it, a way of saying to the men around you and to yourself, I understand what I am about to be asked to do. I understand the weight of it. I am picking it up. And then he put everything he understood into the blade. Because when you carry something with your whole body and your whole attention and the specific gravity of your actual situation, you leave something in it. Thomas did the same at the last parade. My grandfather did the same for 41 years. The weight is not metaphorical, or rather, it is metaphorical and also not simultaneously. The object still weighs 2 pounds 14 ounces by any scale. But a scale measures mass, not meaning. And meaning has weight too, if enough of it accumulates. Meaning has weight you can feel in your shoulders before your arms. Priya, at 15, could see it in the blade without touching it. The terrier on the train could smell it. Jeffrey could see it in my arms. I teach the First World War to year 10 every year, and every year I try to solve the same problem. How do you make them feel it? Not just understand it, a diagram of a trench, a casualty statistic, a timeline. Feel it. Feel the actual weight of it, stripped of its distance from them, stripped of the 90-odd years of subsequent history that has turned it into curriculum. I have never brought the sword into that lesson. I won't. There are protocols, and the protocols exist for reasons, and I believe in the reasons. But I think about it. Every year, I think about what it would mean to set on the desk and say, this object weighs 2 pounds 14 ounces, and a man held it 3 days before a battle in which his friend were killed, and he held it with his whole attention, and he left something in it, and that something has accumulated for 80-odd years across 4 stewards, and I want you to tell me why it feels heavier every year. I think they'd have answers I haven't found yet. Priya would have answers. This past November, the 4th dinner, the 4th year of stewardship, I managed it differently. I don't mean I managed the weight. The weight is what it is, and it will be what it will be, and I have stopped trying to manage it in the sense of resist it. What I mean is, I manage my relationship to it. I lifted the case from the boot of the car in the hotel car park in Derby, which was this year's venue, a hotel in a converted mill building that smelled of old stone and good heating. I lifted it, and I felt the weight immediately, the shift, the load, the descent onto my shoulders of everything that had ever been put in there by everyone who had ever carried it before me. And instead of steadying against it, I let it land. I just let it be what it was. Stood there in the car park in the cold with the case in both hands, and the weight of 4 generations of intention pressing down through my arms, and I didn't fight it, didn't try to compensate, didn't perform the straightness of my posture. I bent, slightly, honestly, and then I carried it in any way. Jeffrey was already inside. He looks older each year, which is simply what happens and which I've made my peace with, but he was upright, and he watched me come through the door with an expression that was different from the expression of the first year, and different from the second, and different from the Nottingham Hotel corridor. It took me a moment to identify the expression. Then I had it. It was recognition, not of the weight, not of the sword, of what I'd figured out, what had happened between the boot of the car and the door of the hotel in 30 feet of dark parking lot and cold November air. There he is, the expression said, or something like it. There's the steward. We didn't talk about it. We went into dinner, and I set the case to the right of my place setting, and I held it for the loyal toast with arms that shook visibly and made no apology for shaking, and the men in black tie around me stood and raised their glasses, and the room held for a moment all the weight of its own assembled history, and I stood in the middle of it. My grandfather was 22 years old when he first attended a regimental dinner. He held the sword for the first time at 23, filling in for someone who'd fallen ill. He was 40 years old by the time he understood what it meant to carry it. He had 41 years of carrying it after that. I have been carrying it for 4. I am 34 years old. I am a secondary school history teacher in Leeds. I did not come from a military family, not in any direct sense, not in the way that would make a stranger understand why this fell to me. I have never served. I have never been in a desert. I have never looked at 47 pages of someone else's handwriting and felt it as a weight in my shoulders rather than a weight in my chest. Except I have. Now I have. I cleaned the blade last month. Regular maintenance. The mirror polish, the careful strokes from hilt to point, the particular attention to the edge. The scabbard properly oiled. 6 months, like the letter said. Not the synthetic rubbish. Somewhere in the process, I stopped thinking about what I was doing and just did it. Not meditation, not anything that grand. Just the specific attention of a task with requirements. The blade threw my face back at me, convex and wide-eyed, the kitchen light behind me a halo of overexposed ceiling. I look the way I look in that blade now. A bit older than my actual face. A bit wider through the shoulders. I'm used to it. I set the blade back in the case. Close the latches. Set the case in its place against the wall in the room where I keep it. Not the bedroom, not the kitchen, its own room, which used to be what the estate agent called a box room, and which is now what I call in my own head, and nowhere else, the room for the sword. I turned the light off. I went to bed. In the morning, like every morning, the sword was there, holding everything it holds, waiting for me to be strong enough to carry it again, which I will be. Not because I'm strong, particularly. I'm not Bernard. I'm not my grandfather at 79, arms rigid with decades of practice. But I'm the steward, and the steward carries what needs to be carried, even when it's heavy. Especially then, there's a weight to some things that has nothing to do with mass. That's the only thing I know for certain. I'm still learning what to do with the knowing.